Mashkote Bijiki Anaquat Lindijnakas, Wab Simon Nunjiba, Nume, Nudem. In my language, it means, my name is Buffalo Cloud. I come from a place called White Dog, and my clan is the Sturgeon clan. I introduce myself that way because my name is not Richard Wagamese. The truth of me is that my name is Buffalo Cloud. A lot of people don't know that, because what you've come to know of me, or sometimes come to understand of me, is the name that appears on books or the name that appears on bylines. And so you come to understand that this person who speaks to you tonight has a name that sounds like Richard Wagamese. But that is not the truth of me. The truth of me arises from stories like this one. This afternoon, we went for a drive, my partner and we drove half an hour or so out of town to a place where stories are carved on stone. Great mysteries are etched there and painted there. We stood on a ground where a virtual university of culture and spirituality and belief in life essence itself as it pertains to the Anishinaabe people was offered free of charge at one time, while the breeze blew through the trees and while the sun shone down and warmed the rocks the people sat on. We went to that place. But importantly is what happened while we were going there. We parked the car. We started to walk along the trail that led to the learning center, and then from there to the place where the rocks were themselves. And if you allowed yourself, you could feel the land close off behind you. You could feel time slow down. You could feel a silence that wasn't filled with nothing, but filled with everything. You could sense the trees vibrating, almost with the intensity of holding themselves in. You could hear birdsong. You could feel the hand of the wind on your face. And the nearer you got to those teaching stones, the more and more all of that began to fill you until you finally walked into the building and looked and saw magic and mystery laid out right in front of you. We stood there and we did that. I asked permission, because I had to take my pouch of tobacco and to go and stand and sit and kneel on those rocks and offer prayers of thanks and gratitude. To say thank you to those ancestors who put those stories down on that rock for future generations who they knew they would never see in person. I had to ask permission to do that. And to offer those prayers, and to say those things, and to offer a blessing at the same time for the people whose homeland I was graced to be allowed to do that on. To feel the tears well up within me for that. And I realized while I was looking at all of those stories and looking at all of the time that had passed since they were first placed down there, that there was the evolution and that there was a story of the people that was presented there and open to my interpretation. And I realized that there, on those stones, in those rocks, was the true story of a people. Interpreted many, many times in a lot of different ways by a lot of different schools of thought, but it was the story of a people nonetheless. And I was glad, and I was sad, and I was heartened, and I was despairing all at the same time for what those stories represented. Because you see, when we talk about truth, we sometimes don't know what it is exactly we're talking about. We have accepted versions that exist in history books and curriculum. We have accepted versions that are passed down orally from generation to generation, all accepted as the truth of the story of a people or the story of a nation. But the truth exists at a whole different level than all of that. The truth exists in the way that makes you feel. If you can get out of your car and you can walk across that same territory that we did and feel that silence and feel that wind and see the way that the sun shines upon the land and have your emotions kindled by experience, then you're able to discern the truth. You're able to shed a tear for the evolution of that story that's carved and painted on those rocks. You're able to bring yourself into an emotional context, and that's where we need to go as a country in order to start talking about the truth, in order so that we can accept that truth and move closer and closer and closer to the definition of what reconciliation will be. That's what we need to do. As Aboriginal people, we're trying as desperately as we can to say, we don't want you, our neighbors, our brothers and our sisters, to feel guilty. We don't want you to feel shame. We don't want you to feel any of those things. What we want you to do is to be able to embrace the truth and say the one spiritual word that matters the most. Yes. Yes, this happened. Yes, that policy was put in place. Yes, these generations of children suffered. Yes, this is what happened to a people. To say that one spiritual word, yes, so that we can all stand together and search for that emotional truth and work toward it, so that the expression of this country comes to be the expression of the hearts and minds and souls of all of us, so that we can move forward into this future together. And if we can get to that, together, then the potential for social greatness that is this country can begin to be expressed by one hand reaching over the fence and finding another and shaking it and introducing ourselves to each other free of anything except a desire to hear more of each other's story. When I hear my brother read from his book about the residential school experience, very touching and very, very emotional to hear that. But you know, people ask me wherever I go, especially since Indian Horse came out, they say, well, Richard, what did they really lose? What did they really lose in those schools? And there's a short section in Indian Horse that actually tells you what it is they lost. One afternoon, during some rare unsupervised time, a dozen of us escaped to the bottom of the ridge the school sat on. A small creek ran along the base of the ridge, curving up out of an inkpot lake and into a larger one. The creek was narrow, maybe 3 feet across, and shallow. It was a sucker creek. The fish swam up at the spawn in the bigger water, and we went down there with burlap bags we'd taken from the barns. We could see the fish pushing up that water. It was thrilling. So much life, so much desperation, so much energy. We stood for a long time and just watched. Then some of us cut saplings and bent them around the inside lip of those sacks. We lowered the sacks into the water and pulled them up dripping and filled with fish. We watched the silvery brown flash as they flopped out onto the bank, their puckered mouths flapping like wet kisses from fat aunties. Their tails flipping and slapping against the ground. We pushed them back into the water and pulled up another sack. We did that 4 times. The 4th time, we stood quietly. Each of us lost in our thoughts as the fish struggled for air, for life, for freedom. When we bent finally and took the fish in our hands to set them back into the water, most of us were crying. We turned as a group and began the long, sloping walk back up the ridge to the school. We walked with our hands cupped around our noses, breathing in the smell of those fish, pushing the slime of them around on our faces. We had no knives to clean them, to flay them. We had no fire to smoke them over. We had no place to store them, no way to keep them. When they lay gasping on the grass, it was ourselves we saw fighting for air. We were Indian kids, and all we had was the smell of those fish in our hands. We fell asleep that night with our noses pressed to our hands, and as the days went by and the smell of those suckers faded, there wasn't a one of us that didn't cry for the loss of the life we'd known before. When the dozen of us cried in the chapel, the nuns smiled, believing it was the promise of their God that had touched us. But we all walked out of there with our hands to our faces, breathing in, breathing in. That's what. That's what was lost. That's what was lost. And you see, you can't, well, you can. I was about to say you can't read that in a book, but obviously you can. What you can't read in the book is the genuine, from the gut, emotional and spiritual outpouring of that loss. The Truth and Reconciliation has managed to effect a great amount of stories being told and heard. People have shared those experiences of that breath of something, that air of something on their skin and on the fabric of their being that they can't replace. So we're talking about that. But the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission ends in 2015. So the next great chore in front of us is to discern for ourselves collectively, as nations of people, and as a nation of people, a gathering of souls that are supposed to be here to live and work together as family, what the face of reconciliation will look like, based upon this truth that something happened here that we all need to recover from. It's not just an Aboriginal issue. It's not just an Aboriginal problem, it's a Canadian problem. Because it's a great spiritual stain on our psyche and the way that we look at our morality as Canadians. We need to come back from that. We need to be able to look at that and say yes. No more fussing around. To say, yes, this is what occurred here. And we all have a responsibility to help each other move away from that. This is what Aboriginal people are looking for. This is what they're fighting for. This is what they're speaking for. And if we can do that, and we join in this struggle together, amazing things will happen, because that's the nature of this country.